Being a hobbyist woodworker, I always enjoy trying out new and exotic wood species, but getting access to them has proven to be difficult and sometimes really expensive. I hit the jackpot a while ago by stumbling across this company called Bell Forest Products. This place specializes in figured exotic woods and has hundreds of species to select from. Say, for instance, you like the look of this one here. You can select it, get all kinds of information about it, but the amazing thing is that you can choose to hand-pick your piece. A list comes up of what they currently have in stock, and you can select one that's the size you're looking for. Then you can view high-res pictures of the front and the back of the board, and if you're happy with the grain patterns and the figuring and the color, just click Add to Cart, and that is the exact board that you're going to get shipped right to your door. Another thing that I've really enjoyed is their craft packs. These are 15-pound boxes of cutoffs that are perfect for making little projects or for using as accents. Here's a sample of a picture of what the exotic wood mix pack is like. But really, the best thing about it is that they make it all super affordable and they ship right to your door. So do yourself a favor and check them out. You can find them over at bellforestproducts.com. Now that I got some pieces to work with, I figured a good way to showcase some of the variety would be to make a cutting board, or 3. Speaking of 3, let's make all these cutting boards 3-dimensional. So the first board I'll be making is called a tumbling block design. Basically, it's a bunch of parallelograms oriented in a way to give the illusion of 3-dimensional cubes. I start off by cutting down some walnut, some maple, and cherry into strips. Then with the miter saw set to 30 degrees, I can start to cut out all of my parallelograms. And that went pretty fast. The best thing about gluing up these hexagons is that they're basically self-centering. I liberated a whole bunch of lobsters at the local seafood restaurant and used all the rubber bands to clamp these together. And I did that for all of them. Once they were dry, the rubber bands came off pretty easily for the most part, but there was a bit of glue squeeze out at the joints that needed to be cleaned up. So to handle that, I had to go around each one with a chisel to clean up the joints. Then I could lay them out and see if they all fit together. I figured it would probably help during the glue-up stages to have some clamping braces set up in a right angle on the bench. And since I don't really care about this bench top, I just screwed right into it. Some packing tape should keep me from making my bench part of the cutting board. And as I was laying out the pattern, I noticed a couple of the blocks didn't want to line up just right. So I marked where they needed some adjustment, and then just sanded them a tiny bit until I got a good fit. Now it's time for glue up. I tackled this 2 rows at a time, and I used perpendicular clamping pressure to pull everything in real tight. Once the first 2 rows were dry, I just repeated the process 2 more times, and then I had a glued up board. I clamped it to my crosscut sled so that I could square off one of the ends and one of the sides. And then I could finish squaring it all off using the table saw fence. I ran it through the planer to get it nice and flat, and then took it over to the router table, where I routed over the edges just a bit. I sanded and raised the grain and sanded some more up to 220, and then this board was done. For a finish, I'm just using food-safe mineral oil. I kind of want to play Q*bert now. For the second board, I wanted to try a design I haven't done before. I'm not sure if this design has a name, but in this video, I'll just refer to it as the Lattice board, since it kind of looks like that once it's all done. I start by resawing down this chunk of cherry into a few small, manageable-sized boards. And then I run them all through the planer to get things smoothed out. I flatten one of the edges on the joiner so then I can use the table saw fence to rip each one down into a bunch of strips. I repeat the process for a whole bunch of maple pieces as well. I put on my 45-degree jig onto my crosscut sled and screwed in a small brace block to help me hold things in place while I make the second cut. Then I went ahead and cut about 1 billion of these little pieces. For the center of the squares, I decided to go with a dark contrast, so I milled up a chunk of purple heart. I ripped it down to a perfect square, and then I chopped off slices of it on the miter saw. And each of the squares goes together something like this. Gluing all these squares up was pretty straightforward, actually. I just crisscrossed a couple clamps, applied equal pressure, and then double-checked all of my corners before leaving them to dry. As you'd expect, there was some squeeze out that needed to be cleaned off at each one, so I took care of that with a chisel. And then to cut them in half, I just ran them through the table saw, making sure to also run the cutoff through so that they're identical. And to cut the quarter pieces, I found this to be the easiest and safest way. It's kind of weird looking, but really it was my only option at the time. And oddly enough, that's what my wife always says about me. With all the pieces cut, I could start to glue them up into their rows. And once each row was dry, I could flatten one side with the hand plane. Then I could trim the whole thing perfectly square on the table saw and then glue up the whole board. Once it was dry, I flattened it on the planer and then rounded over the edges on the router table. Some final sanding and the lattice board was done. Now the centers aren't exactly Barney the Dinosaur purple, but prolonged exposure to UV rays will enrich the color, and they'll purple up over time. The last board I'm making is an interesting design and offers an illusion of depth. Again, I'm not sure what this design is called, but Shop Buddy number 1 suggested I call it the Waffle board, so that's what I'm going with. Belle Forest sent me over some bloodwood to play with. It's an extremely dense hardwood that not only has a beautiful grain, but with the red sawdust, it makes your shop floor look like a scene from an episode of CSI. I start off by cutting about 1 trillion of these little squares and then cutting each of those in half. And for those of you who are about to negatively comment because you think I'm not being safe here, I feel I should also make you aware that I'm doing it all with my eyes closed, and I'm also wearing roller skates while making all these cuts. I cut down some of the curly maple I received, but then I noticed it's more warped than an early 80s David Bowie. So to fix that, I had to severely attack it with a jointer, but I managed to get it all perfectly flat, and I could then cut some thin strips to use as borders between the squares. And then all the triangles got ready to be made into squares. This glue-up jig I had to make was not pretty at all, but just like my parachute, I don't care how ugly it is, I just need it to work. And then each square got a tiny notch cut into it. And I learned the hard way that if you don't have that little relief cut in the stop block, then the table saw fires the little notch across your shop at about Mach 4. And using a chisel, I could clean up the insides of the corners. And if they weren't exactly square, I just pared things down until I had a perfect 90-degree notch. Now it's time to fill those notches. So I cut down some strips of walnut to the right size and then cut them all out over at the bandsaw. Then with a little glue and not enough clamps, I stuck in all the pieces into the squares. Once dry, I used a flush trim saw to cut off the excess. And then used the disc sander to make everything square again. Now, just like before, I can glue up the rows. flatten the side with the hand plane, and then trim them up perfect on the table saw, and glue up the entire board. When it was all dry, I shaved off each side using a crosscut sled and then added on the final 2 curly maple border pieces. And then when those dried, I just trimmed off the excess. A few thousand trips through the planer to get it all flat. A final sanding, and the waffle board was done. Well, there you have it. 3 gorgeous 3-dimensional cutting boards. The question is, which one is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments. Is it the thick tumbling block board made out of maple, cherry, and walnut? The lattice board with cherry and maple squares and the purple heart centers? Or is it the waffle board made from bloodwood and curly maple and walnut? Honestly, I like each one of them, and I'm not sure I can even pick a favorite. Now, if you wanted to build these cutting boards yourself, you'll find links to download the plans for free in the video description. And hey, if you liked the video, please hit that thumbs up, subscribe, and share the link to the video with your mom. You know she'd like to see it. Well, that's it for this one. We'll see you next time. Where's my drill? Oh, it's all the way upstairs in the garage. I need another drill. Jeez. Oh, crap. I lost the end. Oh. Oh, I better roll up my sleeves. Otherwise I'm going to get comments. Roll up your sleeves, you moron! I was just cutting this piece of wood, and as you can see on the end, there are some cracks. And as I was pushing it through, the saw caught and it broke off one of the pieces and threw it back at light speed. And you can even see where it hit on the ductwork. It left a noticeable dent right here because it hit so hard, and then it landed right here. There it is. Oh, you can even see where the saw blade grabbed it. So that's why I never stand directly behind the saw. When you're pushing stuff through, don't stand here. Always stand a little bit off to the side, just like this, because this would have left a nasty wound if it hit me right in the belly. Be safe.